Welcome to Behind the Smile with Ash Butterss, a podcast designed to reveal the truth behind the masks we wear. Together, we look to demystify the human mind and its behaviours in relation to mental health, trauma and addiction. My name's Ash and I'll be your host as we uncover the real stories of people's pain and the steps they've taken to live a life of freedom in recovery. From sobriety to spirituality, join me each week as we uncover the reasons why people seek recovery and how their lives have changed by living one day at a time. Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Smile. Today's guest is Casey McGuire Davidson. Casey helps busy women drink less and live more. She's an ex-red wine girl turned life and sobriety coach at Hello Someday Coaching and helps women create lives they love without alcohol. Casey hosts the top 100 mental health podcast, the Hello Someday podcast for sober curious women. Casey's passionate about helping women who are doing all the things and then coming home and drinking to forget about all the things, change their relationship with alcohol. Casey made the decision to quit drinking on the 18th of February 2016, which means she recently celebrated 7 years of sobriety. Now, Casey and I have been connecting a lot lately, and I was recently interviewed for her podcast, Hello Someday Podcast. That will be coming out in, I believe, April. But today it's my turn. It's my turn to ask Casey all the questions about her incredible story. So with that, I'd love to welcome Casey onto Behind the Smile. How are you, Casey? It's so good to see you again.
Oh, it's good to see you too. I'm super excited to be here.
I'm really excited for my audience to get to know you a little bit better. In the brief time that I've known you over the last couple of months, we've had a few interactions, and I just have to tell everyone listening, you are honestly one of the kindest, most generous people I've ever met, and it's just such a joy to be on this journey with you. So thank you for coming here today.
Oh my gosh, no problem. You're so sweet.
Now, how's your week been? I'd love to kick off just with a check-in. How's the head? Have you been busy? You've been at a podcasting conference.
Yeah, I went to my first podcasting conference last week in Las Vegas, and it was great. We were just chatting about it. I've been friends, the sober podcasting world is not that big. So I've been friends with Jill from Sober Powered for 3 years now since we started our pods. And so I finally got to meet her in person. Last time I was in Las Vegas, we talked about this, was almost 20 years ago. I was at a bachelorette party with my college friends. I've seen the pictures. I remember very little about it. And so this was an interesting experience, right? I don't drink, clearly. I don't smoke, and I could gamble, but I suck at it, so I don't. So it was fun to meet people, and I, like I always say, you've got to find other things to do. So I went on a walking tour of this strip with a small group, which was cool. I went to a neon museum of all the old neon signs in Las Vegas to do photography and just kind of found other ways to amuse myself.
It's so interesting, isn't it? I had a similar experience when I went back to Bali at the end of last year. And I've been to Bali, I would say probably a dozen times, but I'd never been there sober. And it was honestly like experiencing the country for the first time. I'd even visited the same restaurants I'd been to many, many times before. And it was like for the first time I was able to absorb the decor and the food and the experience. And it's like seeing everything through a completely different lens. It's almost like what sobriety is like really in general, isn't it?
I was terrified for sober travel when I was drinking and when I was thinking about stopping drinking. And my coach at the time, because I quit drinking with the sober coach, said, you are going to love sober travel. I wish I could go back and do every trip I did drinking alcohol free. And it's true. It's different. I think we're going to talk about this. I think it's disingenuous to be like, oh my God, every part of my drinking life sucked. Like I had a lot of highlights and a lot of good moments drinking, but sober travel is also amazing. And let's be clear, if drinking was so great, we wouldn't have stopped, right? There were a lot of lowlights too.
Exactly right. If it was still working, then we'd still be doing it. Casey, before we dive into the photo that I've asked you to bring along today, I'd love for our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. So can we start off with you sharing where you live and who do you live with? I'd also love to know what an average day looks like and what do you do for fun?
Yeah. Well, I live in Seattle, Washington, so very much on the other side of the world from you. Although I have visited Melbourne many times. I went to the University of Melbourne for a semester in college, so that was
That's
great.
amazing.
I know we have so much to talk about, but I live in Seattle, Washington. I'm 47 years old, so I live with my husband and two kids. My husband, Mike, and I have been married for 20 years. We met in our first job out of college. I have a 14, almost 15-year-old son, Hank. I have an almost 9-year-old daughter, Lila. And my average day, I worked in corporate digital marketing for 20 years, but I started my own sober coaching business, a podcast. I built a course starting 3 years ago, a little bit more than that. So my average day, I do coaching calls with my clients. I record podcasts. I work on course content. I create assets and tips to help people, guides, all that good stuff. And I love it.
A true sober entrepreneur, aren't you?
Yeah. And I love the entrepreneur part of it too. I get to meet other women like you who are doing very, very cool things. And I think meeting other people in sobriety is one of the coolest things that we get to do because you see how much bigger and more interesting your life gets than when you were drinking. I have to admit, the other thing is I am in the thick of the kid life, with my kids these age. So after our podcast, my daughter is getting off the school bus from third grade. My son has his first high school baseball game. So we're going to do that. So that's kind of my life too.
Yeah, amazing. And how great that you can be present for all of that these days.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into your photo then, Casey. I have asked you to bring in a photo with you today that represents a time in your life where you are hiding behind a smile. So you were projecting one version of yourself to the world, but the reality was that you were struggling on the inside. Can you describe for our listeners what the photo looks like and what's going on for you during that time in your life?
The photo I gave you was a picture of me and my son, Hank. And he was probably just under 2 years old, maybe 18 months old, a year and a half. And before I stopped drinking, I described myself up until when I quit, when he was 8 years old, as a red wine girl. I loved red wine. Every anniversary trip, every date, my husband and I went wine tasting. And so the picture is from this wine region around Washington State. It's called Walla Walla. We were outside of this beautiful winery, K Vintners, where we had just taken pictures of us holding like 6 bottles of wine, of course. And I was with 5 couple friends and their little kids. So we were wine tasting for the day. And all of our kids, there were 5 little kids from the age of 6 months old till 4 years old. And we took them to all of these wineries. So it's me on the grass with a picnic, holding a glass of red with my gorgeous, just little redheaded son. I mean, I adore him. So in the picture, of course, I posted it on social media. Everybody commented, and some of my girlfriends who didn't yet have kids were like, "Oh my God, I love that you're such a wine connoisseur, or should I say consumer, and you're still doing all these great things even though you have your kid. I know Hank's going to be such a connoisseur of wine too." And that was what I would call a drinking highlight. I think that it was fun. At the same time, I was absolutely worried about my drinking. during that time period. Probably, I mean, I always drank a lot. Once I sort of graduated college and moved into my apartment, I pretty much had a drink with dinner every single night. Even when I was like 23 years old and had no idea how to cook, I would have like Lucky Charms for dinner with a glass of red wine. Because that's how classy I was. Right? I was like, oh, this is so sophisticated. But then as I, lived with my husband before we were married, and when we got married and had dinner parties and had my son, it was always, open a bottle of red with dinner. This is how I relax. This is how I have adult time. And I was waking up at 3 a.m. with the, anxious energy, unable to fall back to sleep. I was hungover quite a bit. My eyes were bloodshot. And, what I would say in that picture is when my son was about a year old, I had previously bought all these books when I was a new mom, like Sippy Cups Are Not for Chardonnay and Nap Time is the New Happy Hour. And when he was about a year old, I saw on the front page of the New York Times, there was a story about the woman who wrote those books. And the story was, champion of mommy happy hour gets sober. And the woman who had written the book came out as having an issue with alcohol and that she quit drinking. And like literally the Monday after she decided this on Friday. And I noticed that. I saved it. I bought the paper. I found it online. I copied it. I put it in a Word doc. I titled it something else. So all that is to say is I very clearly was worried about my drinking, knew it was a problem, knew I loved it too much and didn't have an off switch, despite posting on social media these images of me with all of our friends and our beautiful babies drinking at wineries. You know what I mean?
Of course, because that's what we do on social media, isn't it? It is that highlights reel, and it's nobody's going to post a selfie at 3 o'clock in the morning with their bloodshot eyes and they're sweating and they're anxious. Like that's not what happens on social media. When you saw that story of that author, what did you think? Like, was there a realization that maybe I could be doing something different? And had you ever considered sobriety prior to that moment?
It was, oh shit. That was my reaction to it. I was like, this is the woman. I mean, I used to buy her books to give to my friends when they were pregnant, right? This is the woman that I was using as sort of the barometer and the justification for my drinking, as like, see, it's cool. See, it's no big deal. See, this is what fun moms do. And yet she was saying, this is all bullshit. My drinking is a problem. This is not okay. I have to stop. And I had previously, before that, the very first Quit Lit book, right? Book about quitting drinking I had ever read was called Drinking a Love Story by Carolyn Knapp. Have you ever read that one?
I haven't, no.
Yeah. It just had this glass of wine on the cover. It's a memoir, but she is a gorgeous writer. And I was reading it, and the very first page was essentially, I fell in love. And then because what I loved so much was killing me, I had to stop. And it just resonated with me so much. So I had written myself a letter saying, oh my God, I have a problem with alcohol. Shit. You know what I mean? Like, what am I going to do about it? I need to take a break on like a Tuesday. And then by Thursday, I came back and wrote like below that, just kidding, nothing to see. Like, it wasn't even to anyone else. This was like,
it's the denial, isn't it?
I mean, it was just so clear. So I was worried even then. And like I said, my son was a year and a half old. I took my first year off drinking, where I like went to a therapist saying, yikes, when he was 5. And then I went back to drinking when he was 6, after my daughter was born. And I finally stopped when he was 8. So I think most people who worry about their drinking, I think the average is somewhere between 4 and 7 years or 5 and 10 years where they start worrying about it to the point where they actually stop and see life is better without it. And I was right there.
And was there a catalyst to that moment, or had you simply had enough of waking up hungover and feeling like not your best self?
I was, I mean, I think that so many of us stay in that place of, I'm going to take a break. I'm only going to drink 2 drinks. I'm only going to drink 3 times a week. I switched from red wine to white wine because I didn't like it as much. I tried beer because I didn't like it as much. I then bought boxed wine because I thought the issue was the bottle, right? Like once you have 3 glasses, it's almost embarrassing how little's left. So you might as well finish it. So I was like, if I have a box, then I can just have 2 glasses. Okay. Bad call. If anyone's listening to this, definitely don't try that one. So moderating wasn't working. And I used to walk into work, I drank a bottle of wine a night, sometimes a little bit more, 365 nights a year, unless I was trying to not drink. When I was trying to not drink, I would sometimes white knuckle it and only have 2 glasses, or I would say I was taking a break, make it 4 days, drink a bottle, make it 4 more days, drink a bottle. And I'm like, well, that's a lot better than 9 bottles, which is true, but it's still not very good. So I would walk into work hungover, hate putting on my eyeliner with my bloodshot eyes, hate looking in the rearview mirror at my kids to talk to them with my bloodshot eyes. I sometimes felt shaky. I would go into work with like the biggest smile. I mean, I was a gold star girl. I kept getting promoted. I was a director at a Fortune 500 company. And yet, as I walked into work, I would debate in my head, like, okay, do I just abuse alcohol, or am I quote unquote an alcoholic, which is a term I actually don't use anymore about myself or anyone else unless they choose to use it. But I was like, because if I just abuse alcohol, I can like get that under control. And it was sort of this endless tortured place. So when I finally stopped, I was really worried about my mental health. I felt very shaky. I was worried that I was going to screw up my life and my marriage and my kids, that nobody knew, and that it would be my own fault. No one ever told me I should stop drinking. They all knew I loved to drink. There was no question that I didn't remember the end of a decent number of nights. My husband wished I would drink less, but I hung out with a lot of drinkers. Like even my husband didn't want me to not drink. He just wanted me to not pass out on the couch and like.
It's what we do though, isn't it? We surround ourselves. I talk about this all the time because it really blows my mind that when I started meeting non-drinkers, like it blew my mind that there was a portion of the population that even existed that didn't drink alcohol, because my world and my reality for 32 years had been people that drank. I watched my parents drink, I watched my aunts and uncles drink, and then I watched my friends drink. So, I heard a statistic the other day. It's about 30% of the population doesn't drink. But I don't think I'd met a single one of them until I got sober.
Oh, yeah. And I think 20% of the drinkers consume 80% of the alcohol in the world.
Wow.
I was definitely part of that 20%, but
I'm putting
so
my hand
were
up.
a lot of my friends. I mean, when someone's like, oh, I have a glass of wine once a month, I'm like, what the actual fuck is that? Like that's crazy. Why would you do that?
It sounds like torture to me. Like I would rather have none. It kind of touches on that point you made around moderation. And this is when I'm talking to people who are in that space of trying to moderate. I'll only have a couple of drinks on the weekend, or I'll only drink wine on these days. And I try to explain to them that if they do have a problem with alcohol, that moderation is often a really uncomfortable place to sit in. Yeah. And to just be able to simply say, no, I don't drink. Like it takes all of the head miles out of out of the contemplation, and you're just, for me anyway, a much more relaxed, grounded person around the decision.
Yeah.
And then you can really own the decision and be proud of it as well.
I totally agree. And there are a couple things with that I think is important to note. The first of which is drinking is like a magnet. Like the closer you are to drinking, the stronger the pull has on you, for all the reasons, right? You're physically in withdrawal. It's a habit. It's an emotional pull. To you. It's your only reward. Your dopamine levels are suppressed. So you literally are less happy when you're not drinking. But what I tell women I work with is nobody who loves to drink like we did actually wants to stop drinking. What you want is to feel better. And you have to trust the people who've done this before, that if you stop drinking, you will feel better. And it's actually once you get out of that cycle that you can finally see it clearly, that you're finally like, oh God, I don't want to drink because I can't believe I settled for so little. I can't believe I was so used to feeling that way, to sleeping terribly, to feeling anxious, to having so much of my mind space obsessed with drinking or not drinking. It's not till you get away from that you can look back and be like, wow, that was a really bad trade-off that I was making. And you never get that if you're trying to moderate. You never get that clarity.
Yeah, it's so true. I often refer to sobriety for me it's less about not drinking these days, and it's about creating a life for myself that I don't want to escape from.
Yeah.
Because that's what I was doing with alcohol, right? I was checking out every day because life had become so uncomfortable. And when you live in that, I hate to say it, but that space of mediocrity, where every day is just a little bit like Groundhog Day, then it's really hard to jump off the hamster wheel. So by just making that firm decision and giving yourself a chance. I often hear people say, try 12 months, try a full calendar year and live through all 4 seasons. That starts to give you probably the best indication of what a long-term life of sobriety can look like.
Yeah. And
anything
for me, that would have been too much when I started, like so impossible. I could barely get 4 days. So the idea of a year to me was just inconceivable. I started with 100 days. That was what my coach worked with me with. And that was scary, but I was like, okay, I can imagine February, March, April into May. I know what my life is like when I'm drinking. I'm curious enough to see what my life would be like if I wasn't drinking, if I actually trained for a 10K, if I actually enjoyed the spring with my kids, if I actually went to this event and didn't drink. And then once I got close to 100 days, I was like, all right, I'm going to try for 6 months. Once I got to 6 months, I said, I want a full 12 months. I want a full year. And it wasn't until I got to a year that I said to kind of everyone around me, I think I'm done,
I love that you talk about not needing to hit rock bottom. And within that, I'd love to just have a little bit more clarity around, we've spoken about the highlights and how alcohol gave a lot to you, and for a long time it was a lot of fun. But just so that people listening can understand a little bit more about what you mean with these lowlights, can you describe a couple of them? Because I know that there's a lot of people that would listen who perhaps don't identify as being an alcoholic, but they know that alcohol isn't serving them. So maybe for the point of identification, what are some of the other lowlights that you experienced?
Yeah. I mean, so many, right? I describe it as a death of 1,000 cuts. When I say here's what I would say. I never got a DUI. No one ever told me that I should stop drinking. I was very responsible with my kids. Now, I would say a lot of that is because my husband was around. But in terms of the lowlights, let's see. All of them. No, the 3 a.m. wake ups were bad. I would wake up in the morning on the daily, and the first thought in my mind would be, what the fuck is wrong with you? Get your shit together, which is a horrible way to talk to yourself, to think about your life. I was constantly quitting on myself. I was constantly saying I would do something and not following through. I would sit on the couch on Saturday mornings when I said I was going to go to yoga at 10 a.m. I mean, this was not a 7 a.m. class, and feel queasy and tell my kids, like, please don't jump on the couch because mommy doesn't feel very good. I, went on a vacation with my kids. This was actually sort of 2 weeks before I finally quit drinking. And, typical gorgeous resort, horrible dinner. I mean, literally my 8-year-old threw up on the floor of a fancy restaurant. Poor kid. As he was running to the bathroom, my 2-year-old somehow grabbed a plate and shattered it next to another patron. So, the resort was very, very kind. I'd already had, I'd kind of been drinking since like 5 o'clock. We hightailed it out of there, tipped like 3 times the meal we didn't touch, and went back to the room. And they very kindly delivered a bottle of red to our room, which was ridiculous, just to try to be nice. So, of course, drank the bottle. And I remember waking up so ill and going to the bathroom. I was 38 years old. No, I was 40, because I quit 2 weeks later, on the floor, running the sink and trying to puke red wine, which is disgusting, really, really quietly, so I wouldn't wake up my husband and my 2 kids who were on the other side of the door. And that's where you're like, this is so sophisticated to be on my knees, and then you feel like shit the whole next day. I mean, so I think like little and big things were starting to slip through the cracks. It was that way too much?
No, not at all. Not at all. I love when people can just share honestly and vulnerably about their experiences, because look, the reality is so many of us have been there, and yet we don't talk about these things because there's shame attached to it and there's stigma. And I'm so, so passionate about removing that stigma. So thank you for being so honest and sharing that story. What really came out for me listening to that was the point that you had around the negative self-talk, because we know the physical impacts of alcohol, and particularly being hungover, the nausea, vomiting, headaches, all the rest of it. But it's that insidious negative self-talk that is fueled, and it's the depletion of our self-esteem that happens so progressively that you almost don't even notice it.
Yeah.
And that's dangerous.
I mean, the thing that I noticed after I stopped was, I think it was about 6 weeks after I stopped, I used to go into work I hate my job. This is so stressful. My boss is a nightmare, whatever it was. Shaky, mad at myself, wondering where my next highlight would be. And I was walking into work about 6 weeks after I stopped drinking, and it was a beautiful day. It was 7:30 in the morning. The birds were flying, and this feeling of joy just came over me. And I thought to myself, I love my life. And I can't remember before that when the last time is that I just felt like overcome with that genuine joy, to the point where I was teary. I mean, when you stop drinking, you'll notice that like you get so emotional over all the things versus, but I was just like, it was just such a moment that I was like taken aback,
Oh, it's beautiful. I know exactly what you're talking about there. It's almost like when we remove the substance, which I'll speak from my personal experience. I drank a lot to numb because I didn't want to have to feel. And then you remove the substance that has allowed you to numb, and then all of a sudden you actually start feeling everything. I was actually just chatting to a dear friend last night. He's in early recovery and he's crying all the time. And I just said, this is amazing. Like, let it flow. For a lot of us, there's decades of emotions that have been pushed down and not processed. And so being able to feel through them and really then look at life through that new lens and see the beauty in everything is such a powerful place to be. Casey, I'd love to ask you just a little bit more about mummy wine culture. I haven't had a lot of guests on who've spoken to this really, even though it's such a broadly known topic. Can you help me to explain what it actually refers to and, like the ideas around winding down and you deserve it? And can you unpack that a little bit more? Because I think a lot of people have heard the phrase, but we may not understand the complexities within that.
Yeah. I mean, I think for a lot of women, it's counterintuitive, but your drinking actually really takes off often after you have a kid. And there so many reasons for that, but I think the main one is that being a mother, in my experience, is incredibly humbling. And it's harder than anyone describes. And not just hard because, giving birth is hard or having a newborn is hard. But I think women, or at least in my experience, my life changed like 80%. I was on maternity leave. I was home for 12 weeks. My husband's life changed like 20%. And it was just, I was this independent, empowered working woman who went to Pilates and played guitar and saw girlfriends and did all this stuff. And suddenly I was asking permission to go to the gym for an hour and needing my husband to come home so that I could, hand off this child that was crying so loud. Like, I used to put in earplugs so I could hold him and not go insane from the crying. You are supposed to be incredibly happy and grateful. And it is just, this unsatisfied master who is constantly like, what have you done for me lately? And when moms drinking for me was like the one thing I could do while multitasking, right? Like, even when I went back to work, I used to work late and go to the gym during the day and do all these things. But now I was trying to leave work at 5:30 to get to my child's daycare before it closed at 6, to come home, food, bath, bed, invariably 6 things go wrong. And I would be able to drink through it, right? You can drink while you're playing Legos. You can drink while you're doing Candyland. You can drink while the kid's in the bath. And it made me feel like an adult. It made me feel like my husband and I could relax together and like have some connection time. When the mothers got together, it was like how we let loose. We no longer went to bars. We no longer went away for weekends. So, I mean, I remember going to my girlfriend's house over Memorial Day. Both of our kids were sort of 2, 3 years old. Some other friends came. We just drank so much to the point where like I slept over. This was me being responsible, not driving. Her husband was home, right? I mean, somebody was not blotto, but a lot of us were. And I was driving my son home the next day in his car seat and had to pull over the car in a parking lot to puke while he was strapped to his car seat, right? And of course, went home and didn't tell my husband anything about it because he would be mortified, and there are all the signs about it. There's socks. If you can read this, bring mommy wine. There are the dish towels that are like, it's not drinking alone if your dog is here. There are giant wine glasses that say, you wine, I wine. I mean, you're just taught it's a joke. Like women drinking to the point of slurring because their mothers is a joke, and it normalizes binge drinking.
Thank you for explaining that and again sharing your personal experience. I think it's so interesting to hear just how that perpetuates and how it has become in and of itself a culture. I'd love to touch on the conversation now around labels. And this is something I've heard you talk about on your own podcast. And we have really different stances on this.
Yes.
But what I love is that we really respect each other's places in the world around this. So, as you know, I identify as an alcoholic and I'm really proud of that. And I'm proud to be in recovery. And I see that as something that empowers me to stay sober.
Mm-hmm.
But you have a very opposite view. Can you share for our listeners so that we can hear where you land on all of that?
Yeah. And I would say that, like, I don't judge anyone who goes to a 12-step program, who identifies as an alcoholic, who finds that empowering and helpful and helps them connect with other people about it. The first time I stopped drinking when my son was 5 years old, it was a decade ago. And at that time, sort of AA 12-step was really the only thing out there that I knew about. There were not the, sober coaches, Instagram, sober TikTok, online programs the way there are now. There weren't as many sober podcasts and people talking about alcohol-free life. So I went to AA. I went for 4 months. I probably went 5 days a week. So, I mean, in my mind, I'm like, I gave it a go.
I
gave it a go. I went to women's meetings. I got a sponsor. I did the first couple steps. And what I say about it is it was not my jam. And one of the parts I really didn't like was saying, I'm Casey, I'm an alcoholic. First, in my mind, all that did was spur a debate of like, am I really an alcoholic? Maybe I'm not. And what I realized was like, I was having this internal resistance to this term because the portrayals of it are stigmatizing and negative, and I mean, in TV and movies. And I love what you're doing because you're changing that. And so many people are just changing this idea of who is a quote unquote alcoholic. But in my mind, I realized it's completely unnecessary. Technically, it's not a medical term. It's a term associated with Alcoholics Anonymous that was started 80 years ago by 2 white men and who were Christian. I'm not religious. And it's not a medical term, right? There's alcohol use disorder. That's what's in the DSM. There's mild, moderate, and severe. So it is a self-appointed label that is gotten into the popular culture. And I think it's something that keeps a lot of people from deciding not to drink earlier, because in the past you say you're not drinking and people are like, but you're not an alcoholic. Or, well, you're not an alcoholic. Or, are you an alcoholic? And I didn't want to be in that category just for myself. I didn't want that label. And I finally realized that I don't need that label. And I do feel like it implies you're in a 12-step program, which in my mind is one path to doing the work of uncovering why you drink. What does it do for you? Why do you want to numb out? Because I did that too. Is it boundaries? Is it social anxiety? Is it an underlying mental health condition? Is it habit? Whatever it is, it's just one of many paths.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I always like to have these.
Did I offend you at all? Because I really don't want to offend you.
I honestly am not offended in the slightest. Like I said, I'm really proud to be a sober alcoholic. And for me personally, I need the label, because if I just decided that maybe I was a heavy drinker who needed to stop, I can guarantee you that every now and then I'd tell myself that I can drink again.
Yeah. Now, there is no question to me at all. Alcohol is addictive. It's a progressive addiction. I can't drink. if I drink, I'll go back to a bottle of wine a night and it will
Yeah.
only get worse from there. But in my mind, also the word alcoholic is used, and I think it's very helpful to like big alcohol with making it a you problem, not a problem of the substance, and not a public health issue, right? Like drinking is fine for everyone, just drink responsibly. Those people over there can't drink because they're quote unquote alcoholics. Everyone else, there's nothing to see here. And I think that's let alcohol companies skate by on a lot of responsibility that they have over pushing a highly addictive substance that causes 7 kinds of cancer and heart disease and everything else.
Absolutely. And it's like they say, if alcohol was presented as this new drug today in society, there's just no way it would be legal.
Yeah.
And what I love, what I've been taught in my own journey of recovery is that this is absolutely not a moral failure.
Yeah.
And if anything, like alcohol did exactly what it was meant to do.
Yes.
I just did it too well. So I think, we see, even though we use different terms, we have similarities in our viewpoint. And at the end of the day, the key message is it doesn't matter what way you choose to get sober. Choose the way that works for you. If being labeled as an alcoholic or 12-step fellowship works for you, which it does for me, then stick with it because it's an incredible experience. But if it doesn't, please don't let that deter you from looking at a life of sobriety, because that would be such a shame.
Yeah. I mean, I always just say, like, I quit drinking. I used to drink a lot. I stopped. I feel better without it. And alcohol is addictive. And anyone who drinks enough is going to go down the path of becoming habitually, emotionally, physically addicted to it.
Yeah, exactly right. So if you mentioned that to get sober, you went down the path of coaching and finding yourself a sober coach. Can you share a little bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the reason that I think a sober coach was very helpful to me is because I needed someone to actually hold my hand, like to almost reprogram my mind. I needed to be deconditioned from the ideas that I had, the limiting beliefs about life without alcohol, and also the limiting beliefs I had about, like, if I don't drink, then that means X about me. So, I mean, in terms of holding my hand, my sober coach, I signed up with her. She was my sober pen pal for a year. I think I wrote her for 2 years. We exchanged 800 emails. It was Belle Robertson from Tired of Thinking About Drinking. She lives in Paris. And I got sort of all these audios, day 1, day 2, day 3, day 7, day 45. And it really helped me take things bit by bit. Oh my God, day 1, I wanted to drink, right? I signed up with her at this low point and I was like, how the hell do I want to drink tonight? On day 6, and then how do I get through my first weekend? How do I tell my husband what I'm doing? Oh my God, I'm going out to dinner with another couple. What do I order? I'm angry. I'm frustrated. What do I do instead? I'm nervous about this thing coming up. I mean, really to the point of like someone telling me, like, go get sober treats. You're going to crave sugar. Go to bed really early. It's okay if you want to cry. It's okay if you're sad about not drinking. You're going to love sober travel. Like, look at the menu before you go. Pick out what you're going to eat. I needed someone to hold my hand through all those small, like, block and tackling moments. And that really helped me. And that's, now I'm a sober coach. I've been doing it for years. I really work with women through my coaching framework, which I went to one of the largest and most respected international coaching schools, but also through my experience being sober, coaching hundreds of women. So here's what to do your first week. Here are the thoughts that are going to come up. Write down what you think why you drink, why it helps you, because that gives you so many clues about what limiting beliefs you have that you need to replace, but also like other tools you need to cope, to celebrate, to do other things. That's why it was helpful to me. It also didn't include labels. Like my coach was like, yeah, us boozers, us drinkers, those of us who love to, love to drink. And that to me was more approachable.
If somebody was to go down the path of engaging with a sober coach, would they also have then a therapist for outside issues? What's the differentiation between the two?
Yeah. I think they serve very different purposes. And a lot of women I work with have had therapists in the past, and women, once they stop drinking, often get therapy. I know I did when I was 4 months. I'd been to therapy before I quit drinking. I went and I talked about everything except my drinking. I gave my standard answer of like a couple drinks a couple times a week. I told her that I was so stressed out about work and life and woke up, had insomnia. She prescribed me Ambien. So then I was drinking a bottle of wine and taking Ambien. So dangerous. So in my experience, I couldn't do the work that I needed to do in therapy while I was drinking. Drinking just had such a hold over my life in terms of both the results of it that spiked my anxiety, that stopped me from sleeping, that made me less happy, less confident, more angry, more negative than I was. And I wasn't being honest. And I spent so much time thinking about drinking and not drinking and trying to manage it that I didn't have the emotional clarity or capacity to do the work of therapy. Also, a lot of women I talk to go to therapists, and they are just, even if they've done some work on addiction, they've maybe done a 6-week rotation. I've talked to a lot of therapists about this. They have to opt in. It's not standard. They might do a 6-week rotation about it. Different programs don't talk about different approaches. I've heard people go to therapists and therapists are like, well, you're not an alcoholic, or you need to go to a 12-step program. They're really not in the middle. And I honestly believe that if someone has not struggled with alcohol, they don't understand it very well. Like I'm a big fan of like, go to someone who's been there and gotten out of it, however they've done it, versus someone who is going to offer advice or questions while you're in the drinking cycle. While I needed something more prescriptive than, well, let's do cognitive behavioral therapy and analyze how legitimate your thoughts are. Overall, I believe coaching is taking you from where you are to where you want to be. And the women I work with, that is, I am drinking more than I want to. I've tried to moderate and I have not been successful. I want to stop feeling this way. I want alcohol to stop dominating my life. So that's the goal. Therapy, in my mind, is about sort of taking you from a dysfunctional place to a functional place, or looking backwards, building up more understanding and coping skills and self-compassion. So it was actually my therapist who told me to become a sober coach. She, said, I have 10 women I would refer to you tomorrow who work at Amazon and Microsoft and Facebook. I live in Seattle, so tech companies and corporate women are all over the place, just like I was. And she was like, they're struggling with alcohol, but they need so much more than a 50-minute session once a week. And when I coach women one-on-one, we text and email every single day, Fridays, Saturdays, support, resources specific to that. And then we get into all the reasons you drink, your triggers, your marriage, your job, your insecurities. Is your mother a narcissist? I mean, all the things, right?
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying that definition. I loved what you said about the honesty piece, and it makes so much sense to me. I was very, very similar. I spent years seeing different therapists and because I was so good at wearing masks and hiding behind my own smile that I would present this version, even though I'm paying money to sit there to get help. I'm presenting this dishonest version of who I am because I'm afraid of what that person's going to think of me.
Yes.
And I think that is more of a result of when you're in that cycle of addiction or of alcohol overuse. You're often shrouded with all of this shame because you're not your best self. And so what's really cool about sobriety is all of a sudden over time, it doesn't happen overnight, but over time, that self-esteem starts to build. The shame falls away.
Yes.
And as a result of that, you become honest. And there's this sense of, like, for me now, honesty is like my number one value. And so I think then you can go back into therapy in that new sober space and actually really get down to the crux of what you were probably going there in the first place for.
Yeah. And the other thing I think that people have told me, and one of the things I think that I love what you're doing with this podcast and also with 12-Step Fellowship, is the idea that these people get it, that you're not alone and they're not going to judge you. I mean, women are like, oh my God, I've never told someone this, but I know you're not going to judge me because you've heard all my stories. And I'm like, no, I get it. And of course you feel that way. Whereas, like you said, even with a therapist, if they haven't been through it, they might be like, oh my God, you guys drank that much with your 2-year-olds and then you threw up the next morning driving home. And I'm like, yeah, in retrospect, it's just a little bit funny, right?
I mean, I know it doesn't sound great, but, and then, you share that, like, I know I can tell my sponsor anything my sponsees call me. There's nothing I haven't heard. So it's just about finding that identification and those like-minded stories. Casey, what are some of the mistakes that people make when they're trying to break free from alcohol?
Yeah. We may have different approaches on this, but the biggest mistake I see women make, especially when they're in the gray area of drinking, meaning they haven't hit a big bottom, they are not physically going through dangerous withdrawal or anything like that, is thinking about forever or thinking about never again or debating whether they really truly have, quote unquote, a problem. Because I think it stops them before they ever get started. I mean, if you go to a restaurant and you're in the early days and you see someone drinking a glass of whatever it is you love, you're like, I am never going to have that again. I am never going to experience that. I went to a winery when I was like a month sober, and they were having a wine tasting and all these people were tasting wine. I do not recommend, by the way, going to a winery in early sobriety. It was like a birthday hot air balloon thing that had been arranged months before. And I was like, do you have anything else to drink? And they were like, well, there's a water fountain over there. I was like, I'm going to fucking kill you guys. I left there in tears. I went to my car crying. And I describe it as like someone making out with your ex-boyfriend and you loved him so much more than they ever could, you know? And so in my mind, like, treat this, a mistake women make is like, okay, am I an alcoholic or am I not? Let me spend a lot of time debating that question because you can go round and round for years on that. Do I need to stop forever or do I not? And in my mind, it's like, take a longer period of time without alcohol. Treat this as a period of self-care, true self-care, a health challenge, whatever you want to call it. Dive into it with curiosity and see how you feel at the end of it. You know, I'm a sober coach, right? My goal is not to have women who struggle with alcohol to do 100 days alcohol free and go back to drinking. But my goal is to get them to 100 days so they can look back and see how much more energy and clarity and confidence and pride and how much bigger their world has gotten. And the fact that they got through a wedding and they still had fun and they went home for Christmas and this part was better. So that at 100 days, they'll say, I want to go for 6 months versus staying in the, do I actually have a problem with alcohol or do I not, place on day 3. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And it reminds me of something that we say in the rooms, which is one day at a time.
Yeah.
Because you're absolutely right. The thought of never drinking again when, you have a relationship with alcohol, it's something that you love, you can't possibly imagine. I went into rehab thinking that I was just going to learn how to moderate my drinking. I had no intention of, absolutely. I was like, they're going to teach me how to drink like a lady and then I'll be fine again. That was
in
like
rehab. That was the goal.
Yeah. In rehab. That was how deeply rooted my denial was around my relationship with alcohol and how afraid I was to give up. But the really cool thing about keeping it in the day, or like you said, focusing on shorter amounts of time, is that one day builds into 2, into 3, and so on and so forth. And then over that time, you can start to see the benefits of a sober life. And then, you make the choice on your own terms to not want to go back, which is really cool.
And the only thing I want to put out there, and this again is just my experience, the idea of one day at a time, I think for people in early sobriety or who are still drinking, puts forth the idea that you will struggle to not drink for the rest of your life. And that is not my experience. It gets so much easier. Not drinking becomes this identity-based habit, this something that you just live with because it's in alignment with the person you want to be. Now, that is not to say that I think I can in any way screw with alcohol. I don't drink. I have a healthy level of fear around drinking because I know where it'll take me and I know it's addictive. But it is not a one day at a time struggle to not dive over the table and pour myself a glass of wine. Do you feel that way too?
Absolutely. I haven't thought about drinking in, probably, I think within 6 months, the desire to drink left me. And I really the thought of, I can be in a bar, I can be in an environment where there's alcohol and I don't even think about it. It's, it could be wine, it could be water. I'm so indifferent. And now my life is about growing and living in sobriety. It's really the not drinking part is it makes up 5% of my life.
People just don't know. It gets easier.
Yeah.
So
it really
much
does.
easier.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Casey. There's one final question that I would love to ask you, and I finish off this question with all of my guests. That question is, Casey, what are your 3 non-negotiables that allow you to live a life today that is happy, joyous, and free?
I try very, very hard to keep myself in the emotional green zone, meaning not too high and not too low, not too anxious, overwhelmed, upset. In my mind, those are the highs, not too low in terms of sad, lonely, despondent, whatever it is. And so I think it is much more dangerous for me or for anyone to be feeling anxious, overwhelmed, etc. for a longer period of time or super low for a longer period of time. That's more dangerous to drive me to drink than feeling emotionally good and having a glass of wine placed in front of me. And so the good news is that is more of a daily calibration. It's not this huge lift. I have gotten so much better about tapping into my body, tapping into my emotions, my mental health, and boundaries. Boundaries are huge. So what does that mean? Trying to keep myself in the emotional green zone, non-negotiable. So I prioritize myself. Even with 2 kids and a husband and a job, I prioritize myself. I do. I'm really good at boundaries, and I used to be the biggest people pleaser in the entire world. So that's a non-negotiable. A second non-negotiable, honestly, I take medication for anxiety and a mood disorder. My husband in the beginning was like, are you going to take those for the rest of your life? And I was like, hell yes. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't until I got sober that I realized that I had an undiagnosed mild mood disorder, and I thought it was me. I thought I couldn't cope with life. I thought it was because I was drinking too much. I blamed myself for being weak, for feeling that way. And once I got sober, I got on sort of an antidepressant, anti-anxiety pill. I went to a therapist. I saw her for over a year. And it was her, because I was writing my sober coach. I understood what was happening, that we figured out like this descended at a certain time and it lifted at a certain time. It was unrelated to triggers, stuff that should have put me in a place of anxiety didn't. There was no trigger when it happened. And so that was amazing. And so when my husband said that, he was like, "Are you going to keep taking this forever?" And I'm like, hell yes. Like if I never have to feel that way again, amazing. Non-negotiable is not drinking, right? That is something I will never screw with again. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about forever, thinking, am I really not going to drink when my daughter is married? She's 8. But I do know that that's something I can no longer screw with. Was that helpful? I'm trying to think.
That was so helpful. No, I love that. And particularly thank you about sharing about your experience with medication. Again, I think it can be so stigmatized within our community, and having been on and off anti-anxiety medication myself, I really understood what you meant with until somebody's in that experience, similarly to having a dysfunctional relationship with alcohol. If somebody's not experienced it, then they don't understand the relief when you actually find the medication that works.
Yes.
So thank you for sharing that. Casey, if somebody wants to find out more about you, about your coaching business, your incredible podcast, where should they go?
Yeah, the best place to find me is actually at HelloSomedayCoaching.com. I've got a completely free guide to your first 30 days. It's 30 tips for your first month alcohol free, super comprehensive, lots of tips and tricks, how you'll feel, what to do, free resources in there. Like 15,000 women have gotten it. So that's a great resource. And then you can find the Hello Someday podcast anywhere you listen. I have 150 episodes, which is crazy now, but you can just search by topic. I have episodes on anxiety, on marriage, on perfectionism, boundaries, questions to ask yourself about your drinking. Ash, we talked about healthy habits for recovery, which was amazing. So you can scan and pick out what's useful for you.
That's brilliant. I'll make sure that I pop all of that information in the episode show notes. Casey, we say here on Behind the Smile that when we recover loudly, no one needs suffer in silence. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your story here with us today.
Oh, of course. It was a total pleasure. And I love what you're doing. And like I said, I love meeting other people in recovery. I mean, we've got good stories, done some work, are honest, and I, very little surface talk, which I think is amazingly cool.
That's it. The feeling is very mutual. Thanks again.
A big thank you for tuning in today. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so by clicking the subscribe button and leaving a review. Every review helps this podcast become more discoverable, meaning more people can hear these stories of strength and hope. Together, we will continue to remove the stigma around mental health, trauma, and addiction. Remember to reach out to those you care about, and I'll see you next time.